Last fall, the federal Liberals did the unprecedented. They went from third-party status to government in one election, largely on the appeal of an optimistic young leader with a familiar last name. And judging by Justin Trudeau's poll numbers today, Canadians are still happy with their choice. However, with some truly thorny agenda items ahead, can sunny ways continue to carry the day? Joining us now to consider that in the nation's capital, Jeffrey Simpson, national affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail. And here in our studio, Martha Hall-Findlay, former Liberal MP, now an executive fellow at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. John Capabianco, senior partner and national lead for public affairs, Fleischman Hillard. Alejandra Bravo, director of leadership and training at the Broadbent Institute. And Michael Dentant, political columnist with the National Post. And we are delighted to welcome everybody around our literal and metaphorical table, including Ottawa. Let's share these numbers to get us started here. Here's 308.com giving us the aggregation of polls from the month of May. The Liberals are in first place at 48%, Conservatives 29%, New Democrats 14%, Greens and BQ rounding things out at 5 and 4. Jeffrey, the Liberals are 9 points higher today than they were on election day. How come?
I think the Canadian public likes their style, particularly in contrast with what preceded the Liberals. I think they like the spending that the Liberals have engaged in, which the country voted for. I think they like the Prime Minister's performance, and I use the word performance advisedly because they like the public aspect of what he's doing. And I think that they probably like the fact that to this point the government hasn't made any really hard decisions. They built up that increase in their political capital that you mentioned, and they haven't expended it yet. At some point in the not too distant future, they'll have to start expending political capital, and that will be, which means making difficult decisions, which will be the test of whether that capital can be made enduring or whether it will begin to fritter.
Martha Hall-Findlay, what might you add to that list of why the Liberals are up 9 points from Election Day?
Well, I'd agree with everything that Jeffrey just said. I would add that, frankly, polls don't mean squat until the next election. I mean, we have 4 years to go.
But it's an indication that people like what they're seeing.
It's an indication, but it's easy to like what you see when, and people can be flippant about sunny ways, but attitude is really important. And I think a lot of us are thrilled to see a government that is taking an optimistic, what can Canada do attitude. It's fantastic. And certainly all the people in the civil service that we have to rely on, because they do an awful lot of important work, feel as though they can do their work now. I mean, there's a very important aspect to attitude that's really important. But that spending of money feels good now, but you also have to run a country, and you have to run it well. And that is raising a lot of eyebrows. And the fact of not having made decisions. There are a million consultations going on. It's wonderful when people think that they're being asked for their opinion. Without managing some expectations, everybody who's giving their opinion during all these consultations are going to be a little upset when decisions are made that don't actually go with what they said.
Can I do a quick follow-up with you on this? I mean, you ran against Justin Trudeau for the leadership. You're a former Liberal MP. That's a bit of a harshish assessment, considering they're only in 9 months.
Well, actually, if anything, I would add, but I really hope the country does cut them a bit of slack, because they're going to be making mistakes. I think not making some of the really tough decisions early on in a majority mandate may be one of those. I mean, the understood wisdom is you have a majority government. For goodness sake, make some tough decisions early so that then you can kind of explain why and work with it by the time of the next election. No, I'm overall, I think I'm a big fan of the attitude piece. I think it's really important.
People seem to like sunny ways, John. Do you?
Well, it still is sunny in some cases, but I think the Liberals should be happy with the fact that the people that voted for them are still happy with them. In fact, they went up, and I think the margin that they increased by was to a large extent the NDP, who either aren't happy with how things were going and assume that that Trudeau and his government are actually doing some work that they feel comfortable with, hence the growth that he's got. I'm actually surprised and quite pleased that the Conservatives are staying at 29%. They dropped a bit, obviously, but given the leadership contest that's going on, and I think the other thing too, and I agree with Jeffrey in his assessment of why I think Trudeau is doing so well and the government is doing so well, but I also think that it's a perfect storm for the Prime Minister, and that is he's got the honeymoon, he's got people who really voted for him against what they saw from the previous government, so they want him, they almost will him to do well because of that change. But I also think he's facing two parties who are in leadership crisis. Not crisis so much, but in a leadership
there's a vacancy there.
There's a vacancy. Yep. In the case of the NDP, Obviously, they're going to be picking somebody, and they're still debating who's going to be coming in, who's not coming in. And the case of the Conservatives are a little bit further along, and I think there's a choice now, and there's going to be more choices over the next little while. But that's a perfect storm for the Prime Minister and for his party, that the opposition aren't there yet attacking as they should be.
Alejandra, it's not like it's been, perfectly smooth sailing so far. There was Elbowgate. There was this business of selling arms to Saudi Arabia, which a lot of people have deep concerns about. And yet, in spite of that, he's 9 points up. What are you seeing?
Well, absolutely, the issue of tone matters. He's the anti-Harper, and that's what Canadians wanted. They've also fixed some of the sort of big problems that Harper left behind. Got rid of income splitting, tax-free savings accounts, stuff that the Broadband Institute campaigned on. And they've done, in terms of what progressives are looking for, moving the ball down the field, they've done the Canadian Pension Plan expansion, which will help to secure the income of Canadians into the future. But they haven't done any of the really difficult stuff yet, and I think that's what progressives are going to be looking for. What about social policy? What about taxation policy? Like, they haven't really addressed some of the difficult things that Harper left behind in terms of, for example, the federal government revenues. The rich and corporations aren't paying a fair share. That's going to be very difficult to take action on childcare, on pharmacare, and other things that Canadians care about. And at the same time, we have to remember that in the first year of a Trudeau government, there is less money coming into coffers than there was in the last year of a Harper government. That's going to be very difficult to satisfy. And then they haven't done some of the things that they should have got to quickly, like doing something about C-51. So they were brought in by
the anti-terrorism law.
Yes, they were brought in by a coalition of progressives, totally agree. That included young voters in unprecedented numbers and New Democrats. And they're going to be looking for a progressive agenda.
I'm not sure anybody's left anything left for Michael Danton to say, but if there is, I'm sure he knows what it is.
Well, look, I agree with a lot of what the other guests have said. I guess I would say that I think we're being a little tough on them. And I think it's right to be tough on them. But to say that they haven't done anything difficult yet, I think is a little unfair in the sense that the Bill C-14, the assisted dying law, was one of the toughest things I think that any Canadian government has handled in terms of the public debate, in terms of the emotions on both sides. And they seem to have negotiated and threaded a way through that without it completely blowing up in their faces, although it was a very near-run thing. And I think this pension agreement that they just struck sort of virtually out of thin air in the waning days of the sitting is also a pretty remarkable thing in the sense that we didn't hear anything about it. There was no federal provincial conference. There was no, drama. There was none of that. They simply worked this out and unveiled it. And that is something that never happened that I can recall in the 10 years of Harper government, because the relationship between the federal government and the provinces was so, it wasn't toxic, but I think it's fair to say that it was frosty. There wasn't a lot of communication, and that has changed. That, combined with the fact that you have, a lot of ministers who are pretty good communicators, who are willing to communicate, who engage with the media and with the public on a regular basis. I think that has it creates a general sense that these guys are working and they're trying to get things done. It's not that they don't make mistakes; they have made some big mistakes, but I think the poll numbers reflect the sense that they are trying their best to deal with some of these big problems.
Let me follow up on one of those issues with Jeffrey. C-14, the doctor-assisted dying bill. How well or badly, Jeffrey, do you think they got that done at the end of the day?
I think they got it done well, because I think they took a respectful attitude. That is to say, with regard to the Senate, they listened to what the Senate had to say. The minister actually produced a paper responding to the critical observations of the senators, and reiterated why she and the government took the position they did. I know there were various members of Parliament and certainly a number of constitutional experts, one of whom was Peter Hogg, whom I respect hugely, who said, look, this bill doesn't meet the test that the Supreme Court laid down, so you should change it according to what the Supreme Court said should be the definition permitting assisted dying. My own view is we elected these people, not the Supreme Court. If at the end of the day the Supreme Court can't accept what Parliament has done, it will say so. But to my way of thinking, Parliament acted in a serious way. It set up a dialogue with the courts, and we'll see whether the Supreme Court respects what Parliament has done or not. So I think they performed well. I think the two ministers who had carriage of this, Ms. Philpott in Health and Wilson-Raybould in Justice, both did extremely well.
And on the pension issue, Martha, again, sort of no news all the way along, and then suddenly a deal at the end of the day. You're going to give them kudos on that?
Yes, I think we do need to give kudos to Ontario for pushing. My personal bias, I'm really glad Ontario is not going to go it alone. I just think added bureaucracy was going to be disastrous. So I'm
But as a
thrilled.
bargaining chip, it seems to have worked.
But to the extent that that helped actually get this moving forward, I mean, there are going to be issues, there are going to be challenges. You know, when the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, which usually pretty thoughtful on some things, came out and said this is going to be devastating. The timelines are long. This is not going to be devastating. The challenge, of course, from the business side is that it is in fact an additional ineffective payroll tax. And the problem is that on the economics, you know, most of the studies that make sense in terms of real analysis, added taxes on corporations don't actually hurt the corporations. They actually make it harder for employees. I know it seems counterintuitive, but that's how the economics of it work. So that'll play out. But I agree. I think the fact that this was done, and that goes back to my early comment about attitude. The federal government wants to actually work with the provinces. What a lovely thought. And we can accomplish a lot with that, I think.
I so want to sort of take you on that, but that's a different show. So I'm going to leave that for another time. But I will say this, the Liberals are doing, John, their level best to overturn pretty much everything Stephen Harper did over the course of 10 years. And if you look at, issue after issue after issue after issue, one wonders at the end of the day if there will be anything left of the Harper legacy at all.
Well, and that's true, Stephen. I think that there's no question.
People seem to be buying it.
Well, they seem to be, and I think that's why they voted for Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, was to actually overturn or change the way things were being done in the last 10 years. And I think that a lot of surprise of Canadians, quite frankly, is that a lot of governments talk about changing the way things are from the previous government and never do. But this government actually came in and started doing it. So I give a lot of credit for them for keeping that promise. And certainly some of these bills, the 25,000 Syrian refugees, there's a lot of bills, a lot of issues, and a lot of policies they talked about on the campaign that they kind of clumsily dealt with, but got the job done. With the 25,000 refugees, it was timing, then they finally got it done. With the assisted dying bill, as emotional as it was, and by the way, I would say that the big winner in that, from a parliamentary perspective, was the Senate. I actually felt that the Senate really did its job for the first time.
They looked relevant.
It looked relevant. They debated it. They came back with some relevant amendments that they thought they needed to have. They went back to the House. They debated it, went back to the Senate, and they decided that at the end of the day, the elected officials should win out on that. So I give credit to the Senate, and it actually made the Senate look good. And to some extent, it made Justin Trudeau look good because he's the one that brought in those independent senators who, in fact, some of them played a significant role in that bill. But back to the issue of that, plus, because Elbowgate kind of created a bit of a stir with respect to that particular bill. The pension one I thought was interesting because they managed expectations. No one heard about it. They kind of quietly and behind the scenes worked with the various provinces, and for them to come up with a deal with 8 provinces, let alone any provinces, agreeing to it with 50% of the population is a significant amount of effort and quite frankly skill to get it done.
Including Saskatchewan's Brad Wall, who was a conservative say no from the get-go.
So I do give them credit. At the end of the day, as a conservative, but I do give credit where credit is due, and they've got these bills done. I think it's a lot like sausage making, where the process of making sausage is not the best, but at the end of the day, the product is good, and I think they've got the bills done, and they end the session with, I think, relatively positive marks, I'd say.
Alejandra, can you recall a leader who had the theatrics of the job more under control than this Prime Minister?
No, absolutely not. I think that it's clear that he loves the camera loves him. He has an incredible relationship with the public. That change of style is something that appeals to Canadians, but I think there's also a bit of a risk in that because I go back to the progressive coalition that he built to actually get elected, to convince New Democratic voters in certain areas to support him, and to turn out that, one of the untold things about this election, or not celebrated enough, is that young voters under 30 are voting at a rate almost to the level of people who are senior. And that's an incredible shift. If you look at the demands that young people are going to be making and going forward, you don't have to look too far. Look at the Bernie Sanders momentum with youth. I think young people are going to be looking for transformational changes. And so the substance is going to have to, at some point, catch up to the style. Young people live mostly in cities. 80% of the Canadian population is in cities. Housing is unaffordable. There's literal sinkholes in the capacity of municipalities to respond to infrastructure needs.
There is a literal sinkhole in Ottawa, too.
Absolutely. And people are stuck on transit, et cetera. And they're going to need childcare to go forward. A lot of what they've done has been focused on those older voters. And I think that at some point, this style thing is going to have to be rationalized with the substance part.
Let me ask the two newspaper columnists here about one word you used in that answer, Alejandra, and that is transformational. There are transactional and there are transformational leaders. Certainly, Mr. Trudeau hopes he's the latter. From what you've seen so far, Michael, is he?
I think it's too early to say. I mean, certainly the changes that we've seen in the Senate, if they hold and if they turn out to work, and we've just seen them pass their first big test. I completely agree with John that the Senate really kind of comes out of the whole C-14 process a lot stronger than it went in, and some of the credit goes to the government for that. If that holds, if it turns out to repeat itself in terms of successful critiques by senators, informed critiques by senators that result in some modifications to bills, improvements to bills arguably, but not a loggerhead or a deadlock between the two houses of Parliament, if that becomes the new way that things get done, then I think just on that alone, there's an element of transformational.
And not partisan. And not, finally, there seems to be a sense that it's a whole lot more on the issue and not on partisan lines, which is refreshing.
Jeffrey, do you see a transformational leader in the making here?
The platform of the party and the mandate letters that the Prime Minister sent to the ministers were the most ambitious that I've seen in my too many years doing what I've been doing. My question then and my question now is, have they outlined an agenda that is so broad and so ambitious that you will suffer the reverse of what Jean Chrétien used to say, and Martha will remember him saying, it's better to underperform and overdeliver. Mm-hmm. I have never seen so many ships been sent out from a harbor as I've seen from this government. Not a week goes by, and I use my words advisedly here, without a new study, review, consultation, commission, or whatever being announced. Last week, there were two, one into university research, another into innovation. Just a few days ago, I think it was 6 ministers, perhaps it was 4, Michael will correct me, announced a review, a sweeping review of the regulatory procedures for projects, resource projects. I read in the newspaper yesterday in a speech by Mr. Garneau, the transport minister, that his department is conducting a review of the previous review, the public review, led by former Minister David Emerson into transportation policy, and I could go on. I'll mention one or two more though. Madame Joly, the heritage minister, she didn't have it in either the platform or the mandate letter to announce an enormous review of cultural and communications policies. We have, of course, the review of the electoral system. We have the review of pipelines and et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, does the government, does any government, have the capacity to bring all those ships home? And I'm not saying these are bad or good ideas. I'm simply saying, do you have the capacity to deliver policy changes on so many fronts simultaneously? We just had a successful pension negotiation. I totally agree with my colleagues on the panel about that. But they have serious negotiations with the provinces having to do with health care, multi-billions of dollars. Can that be brought to a successful conclusion? The missing and murdered Aboriginal women's, whatever you want to call it, inquiry or review, that was promised in October. We're now coming up to July. It's very, very much more complicated than the ministers had let on, because if you accept the proposition, as the Minister of Indigenous Affairs does, that there were many, many, many cases that never got reviewed or that were bungled in their review, then you have to go back and look at those hundreds of cases. And the RCMP officials who were involved at the time may be put under scrutiny. They'll require lawyers to defend them. And this could go on for years and cost way more money than the government ever intended. I could go on. So it's a capacity problem to deal with so many ships that they've sent out to sea.
Well, and we could add one more item to the list, and that is marijuana, which a lot of people thought might have been legalized by now, but that is also
legalized.
Bill Blair is...
There are now, Steve, I haven't seen them, but I'm told there are now websites in Ottawa which are tracking the number of these commitments that have been made and studies and commissions and consultations. And apparently, you know, we're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens of them.
So let's, Jeffrey's asked a good question. Martha Hall, why don't you jump in on an answer? Is government capable of sending this many ships out of harbor and actually having them come back in and making decisions about them?
Well, they're pretty capable of sending them out. I agree with Jeffrey that the challenge will be in delivering. I think there really is a sense that these folks want to get things done. I mean, you see, if anything, a competitive spirit among the ministers. You know, well, you're going to do that, I'm going to get something done. And they're all going to face similar pressures to actually show results. And so, you know, there's a driver happening. One of the challenges
Martha,
that I have...
Can I just...
Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Because you're sensitive to this, and you mentioned to bring the ships home within a budget that can allow all the ships to get to harbor.
Which is exactly where I was going to go, Jeffrey. All these consultations alone cost money. They are expensive to do. Delivering results based on those will be even more expensive because also the government has set itself up as a spending government. You know, remember the Prime Minister went to the G7, you know, to a couple of world leaders who were working on an austerity premise, and, you know, sunny ways and austerity don't necessarily mix. And I have to say, I think, you know, this government, in not managing expectations, in consulting with everybody without saying, but by the way, just because you tell us what you want doesn't mean you're going to get what you want, is a really important part of this. And we're also seeing economic growth. We're not in a recession. This is not 2008, 2009. If it may not be the growth at a rate that we would have preferred or that may have been predicted, but when you're spending like crazy in a time of some economic growth, what's going to happen for 8, 10 years down the road? And we actually really need to be tough in terms of finances. We've kind of been there and done that, and it wasn't easy.
I wonder, John, if part of the lesson here is, as long as you are seen to be earnest and trying hard and meaning well, the public is kind of with you.
To a certain extent, to a certain extent. And I think the whole issue of whether or not the Prime Minister is transformational is yet to, I think Michael's right, it's yet to be determined. I think he certainly wants to set that stage and sort of be that kind of Prime Minister, but it's only been 6 months, and I think that we've talked a lot about the kudos of the work that he's done to date in getting some of these bills passed, but it's amazing how budget time tends to really focus people on issues that are pocketbook issues. So a lot of these ships are being sent out, but, you know, harbor could be a very lonely place when it comes down to the budget, and I think that's going to be critical. They got away with a $30 billion deficit this time around, just even higher than what they projected in the election campaign, and people agreed that, okay, let's let that happen. But the next time budget comes around, if they don't see a sense of that sort of being chipped away, or if it's getting grower, people will get a bit impatient with respect to that. So all of these things happening are good, but people will start focusing on their pocketbook issues, which is going to be critical. And I always equate what happened with Justin Trudeau to what happened with Barack Obama back when he got elected. The hope, the aspiration, the 80% approval ratings. And after 2 years, Obama lost the midterm elections.
Yeah, but it's such a different political system, right? Obama's not the master of his own fate down south, whereas Trudeau's got a majority government here.
But the expectations, you're absolutely right, but the expectations of what Obama had was going to be the savior of the world, you know, and that kind of thing. And then all it took was 2 or 3 failed attempts at legislation to all of a sudden turn the channel. And I think with the Prime Minister, there's no question he's got the good faith and everybody's willing him on. But I do think that the next budget and the sort of midterm is going to be an important time, especially when both parties have their leaders in place and will be actually attacking him in a way that the interim leaders can't do, or Mulcair can't do with legitimacy.
Well, let me ask the Broadband Institute about that. At what point, if the finance minister tries to actually put the brakes on some of this spending, because he is concerned at the end of the day about balancing the budget once again, probably not in this mandate, but maybe if he gets a second one, at what point does the Broadband Institute start to scream bloody murder that, hey, wait a sec, we still have all these needs that need meeting?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I said was to talk about the fiscal hole, like this government, to deliver on the mandate that it has set for itself, needs to raise more revenues. It needs to look at corporate taxes. It needs to look at the balance between the average Canadian and the rich. And until we address that, it's very difficult to fund reconciliation and First Nations education. It's very difficult to fund the kind of programs that are needed. But to go back to the question of consultation and transformation, I think that's really important. A year ago, the Liberals promised to end first past the post electoral system and to make every vote count. The only way to do that is with a proportional system. If we're going to end...
wait a a sec. Can't let that one go by. That's not the only way to do it.
Well,
That's a way to do it.
You have
Yeah.
you have a majoritarian system or a proportional system. There's a lot of different ways to play in between those two, but they did promise to end first past the post. So how do you do that? Right now, the only civil society claim, the only groups that have come together are asking for proportionality. And each time this issue has been studied by academics or by citizens, we've ended up there. But in terms of transformation and really difficult decisions, I think that we have to put climate action and carbon on the table today. We need to know, as Jeffrey said, whether they're going to be spending any political capital. The capital that right now Kathleen Wynne and Rachel Notley are spending, in Alberta, the Notley government is under huge pressure when they're actually the ones that are doing the heavy lifting around carbon. Will they actually reverse what's been a complete federal government lack of leadership on environment since the Mulroney years?
I want to go back to actually what you said in the middle of that answer, and that is pick up on the democratic reform angle with you, Michael. Because if there has been one pretty big hiccup so far in the Liberal government's time in office, since it won last October's election, it is this issue of how, not even what the finish line will look like, but how to even begin to get to the finish line. Is it going to be a referendum? Is it going to be done by a parliamentary committee? What kind of role or say will the public have, and how will they have that? How are they managing all of those expectations?
Well, paradoxically, the democratic reform agenda was one of the government's glaring weak spots through May, and it then, through the, in my opinion anyway, through the nature of the way they were forced to or came about to a compromise on, it actually turned out to be a bit of a win for them in the sense that it showed that despite having a majority government, they're not going to behave like their predecessors and just ram things through, against the overwhelming will of the opposition. And the elbow, I'm not going to call it Elbowgate because Nixon quit in 1974, and I think it's time we all moved on. But
Thank you for that.
The elbow, which was I think May the 18th, happened in the context of a debate over C-14 and also a debate over democratic reform, which the Liberals were losing. I mean, they were getting hammered daily, and Miriam Monsef, the democratic reform minister, was really not making any headway at all with her messaging. She kept smiling and sort of conveying a sense of sort of beatific benevolence towards the opposition, and can't we all get along? Trust us, we're going to do the right thing. And the opposition was saying, give me a break. We're not going to trust you. We need a referendum. We need this committee that's going to study democratic reform to be proportional, not stacked with Liberals. And it was really causing them, the Liberals, quite a bit of grief. And so they, at the end of May, early June, they turned around and they said, you know what? We were wrong. We're going to change the way we're doing this. And
did that win points with you when they did that?
It did, because I thought, you know what, that's not something that we would have seen under the former government. And Trudeau himself made that point. He said, you know, we've been behaving too much like our predecessors. I don't know if that was his exact language, but that's essentially what he said.
Yep.
And that kind of ability to juke, you know, or that's a football term, but to kind of to deke and to move and to adapt is critically important. It's especially, I would argue, for a majority government.
I would say,
sorry, Jeffrey, go ahead.
I want to say that I think this issue of electoral reform can be a very serious liability for the government, and I'll explain briefly why. It is asserted that it was central to the election campaign. It was not. I invite you to review the leaders' debates. It was barely mentioned. It is false to say that the New Democrats and the Liberals have any kind of agreement among themselves as to what should replace the first-past-the-post system. You mentioned at the beginning of our remarks some polls. A week ago, there was a Léger marketing poll in Quebec, only Quebec, looking at public opinion there. And when they asked should there be a referendum on electoral reform, 57% said yes, way more than should there be a referendum on Quebec secession, about the same level as the popularity of the government. There's a fundamental principle involved here that the Constitution and the electoral system are the superstructures within which we have our democratic system, and they should not be changed at the whim of or because of deals made by partisan interests pursuing their own gains. Only the people should decide whether we change the system. And if the Liberals continue with their New Democratic friends, and I'm not saying this as a conservative partisan, but rather as a matter of principle, because electoral change has been approved by referendums in other jurisdictions. So to argue, as the Prime Minister did, that if you put the matter to the people, they always vote for the status quo, is patently false on the historical record. So I think if you take the case to the public that you, Mr. and Mrs. Canadian, should have the ultimate say on this, you will beat the partisan interests of the political parties that oppose a referendum.
What about a referendum after trying a new system? I think that a referendum is a yes or no question, and political scientists have been studied whether it's the right tool to do for like really deep, meaningful deliberation. And I think if you look at the evidence and the studies over time where citizens have been actively engaged, they have pointed to a proportional system. I like Nathan Cullen's idea. Why don't we try out the system and then have a referendum after? Because how do you reduce design of a new electoral system to a yes or no answer?
Jeffrey, go ahead.
Well, we do that in election campaigns. We say you vote for this party, or this party. That's unfortunately the way the democratic system works. We don't live in a Greek polis anymore. And I don't think the Canadian public wants the question put to them to be determined by the partisan pursuit of gain, which is exactly what is happening now. The New Democratic Party wants, for its own reason, proportional representation. The Conservative Party, for its own reason, wants first past the post. And the Liberals, although they don't come out and say it, want preferential voting because they're the most popular second party in the country and they will gain from it. So what emerges from this, what was called sausage factory, if it's designed the way you want it, that is to say, let's have the system, let's put it in place for 10 years and then vote on it. That system will be the result of partisan manipulation and not the public's will.
Okay,
and that is anti-democratic.
I'm going to play speaker here and jump in and bring the gavel down because we're literally down to our last minute and a half. And I can't do this discussion without pointing out the fact that our guest in Ottawa, after 4 decades plus covering the national scene in this country, is about to hang up his typewriter or whatever the expression is these days. Jeffrey Simpson, you've had a hell of a...
I'm so old I started with it.
You've had a hell of a run, Jeffrey Simpson, and I just want to ask you finally tonight, what are you going to miss not being able to cover that you see rolling out over the next few years?
No, I think that the greatest issues from a policy point of view are, can we somehow marry the environment and energy? And I think the government is wrestling with that, and I think the country will be wrestling with it for quite a long period of time. We've had great success in 3 major areas. We've gotten through national unity crises. We brought the West much more successfully into Canada, and we have assimilated millions of people from around the world into our country with a minimum of political and social disturbance. And I end my career having cajoled and criticized governments of all stripes, but I recognize some of the singular gains of our country. And by the way, just to tie that to what I said before, I think we've been arguably the best governed country in the Western world for the last 40 years. And we've done it under a system that this government, for reasons best known to itself, wants to throw out. One should reflect seriously upon that.
You have made us reflect seriously on a bevy of issues over the years. You've always been required reading in this person's household, and I'm so glad that you've answered the call when we've asked you to come on this program over the years. Godspeed, Jeffrey Simpson. Great to have you on TVO tonight.
Thank you, Steve, very much.
And to our friends around the table here, thanks for your participation tonight as well.
Thanks
thank
very
you.
much.
And thanks, Jeffrey.
All the best, Jeff.
Yep.
Congratulations.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.